I sort of at least pretended to know a little bit about the content. I'm not going to pretend that I know much about the content of the next two, other than a little bit of sort of light preparatory reading. The first talk comes from Ben Coles, and Ben works at Leicester University, where he describes himself as a geographer, but it seems to me he's doing a bit more than geography. And the talk is a fascinating talk about industrial and industrialized food production. So with that, I'll hand over to Ben.
Does that work? Yes. Rad. Okay, what do I push? Oh. Cool. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to me talk, or coming to listen to me talk. I want to thank Larry first off for inviting me on a rather surprising Sunday morning email reading. I also have to thank Meredith for putting up with my seeming inability to respond to email in a timely fashion. Also, thank you, Jack, for the introduction and not calling me Benjamin. Being somewhat of an interloper in what on the surface looks like a biomedical hard science, if you like, symposium is an extraordinarily wonderful experience because it means I can be self-indulgent and sit back and watch and listen and find out what lots of other people who are doing really cool things are doing and how they frame their problems. It turns out that the distances between what I do and what the rest of you, some of the rest of you do, aren't that big when we start thinking about broader kinds of issues. So I think there's going to be some resonances in what I'm going to talk about today, which is about chickens and about the Anthropocene. Which is an emergent geological epoch that demarcates our immutable impact on planetary ecosystems, or planetary systems as a whole. And for us humans, this new era, or new theorized era, is characterized by a growing certainty of uncertainty. What I'm really going to talk about, though, is contemporary food provision and the political economy of agriculture, something that I call agri-capitalism, and why, in my view, we need to reject it and radically remake the spaces of our food provision altogether. As I've been watching, I've come to notice that there are two broadly tacit rules about giving a talk here. One is not to be overtly political, and I'm happy to see that some people have smashed that one to pieces. The other one is to not swear too much. Given that I'm talking about political economy, I'm going to have to be political, but hopefully with a small p rather than a big T. For me, what that means is thinking about power and thinking about the relationship between power and place, or in what the phrase of a late geographer called Doreen Massey likes to think about, is the asymmetric power geometries, the ways in which people like us in the global north and west, the global elites, if you will, have the power to affect the rest of the planet at will and very easily. So that's how I'm going to be political. I will try not to be too sweary. As a human geographer, I use the Anthropocene term somewhat more loosely than my geological and atmospheric science colleagues, in that I use it more liberally and metaphorically to get past the rather arrogant notion of an anthrocentric geological era. I use the term to signal that there are particular human practices, namely industrial agriculture, that have fundamentally changed the planet, and that future geologists might find traces of this in the planetary record and call it something. Perhaps a more apt expression for my purposes today is Jason Weiss's notion of capitalocene, because as he argues, although humans have undeniably altered the planet, particularly from the inception of contemporary society and the agricultural revolution, whereas it turns out we managed to trickle just enough carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to stave off another glaciation. But as Weiss wants to argue, things really didn't take off until the era of empire, nation building, colonial expansion, and ultimately the Industrial Revolution and market capitalism as we know today. I suggest all of this is visible in the body of the contemporary broiler chicken. Wait for it. To get to this, I need to start with a story. I am a geographer, interdisciplinary perhaps. I also have trained in anthropology, so I like to tell stories. I like to do ethnography, which means field work. I call it topography because I like places as well. So I will begin with my story. There's a slaughterhouse, or more precisely, a chicken production facility that processes, kills, packages, freezes, ships, and recycles the waste, a slaughterhouse plus, located in the southern Amazonian state of Mato Grosso. It claims to have the capacity to process 500,000 chickens a day. I love that reaction. I do that on purpose. Assuming continuous production and not accounting for stoppages that invariably happen either owing to equipment failures or to routine cleaning that invariably happen. The quick math on the back of a drinks napkin suggests that this is 182.5 million chickens a year, 20,800 chickens per hour, 347 chickens a minute, or just under 6 chickens a second. If I weren't so terribly bad at Visual Basic scripts, I would have put a timer or a clock thingy in the side of the PowerPoint that would go up by 6 every second just to iterate that point. So if you can use your imaginations, just picture that up there. Given the handful of guests in the audience, there is some shock at this number. When I first heard it, I had to question whether or not I understood and heard Portuguese correctly. It turned out that I did. On closer inspection, however, although 500,000 chickens a day is on the high end of industrial production, given that there's somewhere between 25 and 50 billion chickens alive on the planet for food during a given year, this number begins to make more sense. For instance, somewhere in the US South, a state called Arkansas, there are numerous facilities that produce chickens upwards to 250,000 a day. So this 500,000 a day isn't all that extreme. What this number does, though, is it speaks volumes about chickens' ubiquity and the veritable explosion of chickens as a source of protein over the last almost century. Predominantly, these are the broiler chickens that those of us who do eat chickens eat, regardless of where they come from and how they're produced. They're all produced through similar production regimes and are comprised of nearly identical genetic stock. As I understand from a colleague at Oxford called Gregor Larson, who's a geneticist, he suggests they're all the same genotype or genome. I can't comment about that, but I tend to believe him. So all of this puts the killing of 500,000 chickens today into some kind of perspective. My point in stressing this at the onset, though, is that we need to be wary of knee-jerk reactions when it comes to moral arguments around food and food provision, especially those that lead to easy conclusions about what constitutes good and bad food. Something we all have an idea of, but we all might need to think about more carefully. Questioning the slaughter of 500,000 chickens a day in one place on moral grounds, for instance, means to come up with a more appropriate number of chickens to kill each day. Presumably that number is somewhere between 0 and 500,000. Our vegetarian friends possibly have this air of smugness about them right now, saying, I don't eat chickens, not my problem. But when we think about the embeddedness and the interconnectedness of agriculture and that these 500,000 chickens eat a lot of soya, and that the constitution of the global market for soybeans and other grains means that a lot of the soya that goes into chickens also goes into our tofu, that might make the vegetarians somewhat less smug. Though this interconnectedness and interdependence of food with other resources, namely water and energy, such questions extended to their logical conclusion become about the appropriate allocation and distribution of resources. Who gets to eat and drink or be warm, and who does not, and how these decisions are made. And the practices and decisions behind this is what I'm really going to talk about. Of course, these decisions are made by something called the market, and something that we all have a vested interest in reproducing. And when I say market, I mean the market, the ethereal economy that seems to reproduce our daily lives. Thus, I argue that to begin to address the moral, philosophical quandary of 500,000 chickens a day means stepping away from the materialist concerns of the market, and our materialist concerns at that, and questioning instead the spatialities and temporalities mobilized in its maintenance. That's an image ripped off from TV Morena of this mythical chicken factory. The motorbike in the front gives you some idea of its scale. It's actually quite hard to find despite its size. These questions, I'll put them on the board and let you read them. These questions, I think, underpin what I argue what contemporary food provision and the system of agrocapitalism from which it comes out is what agrocapitalism is all about. They signal a set of wicked problems, which are not only spatial, but deserve spatial solutions to solve them. Before I get to the meat of this paper, I need to position myself conceptually and philosophically within the broader narrative of the Anthropocene. I touch upon the Anthropocene as a geographer rather than a geologist or an atmospheric scientist or even an evolutionary biologist because it enables me to think about and explore its spatialities, the particular kinds of imaginations and materialities out of which the Anthropocene emerged, and begin speculating about the kinds of spaces that will be necessary to have and engage with in the future. I will return to chickens, and after prefacing their ascendance as part of the rise of agrocapitalism, I will deploy them as an objective corollary through which I illustrate the multiple entangled spaces of contemporary food provision and agrocapitalism. We can follow chickens, we can follow almost anything in order to uncover its spatialities, the various ways it constructs and reproduces space and time. I'll close with some ideas about how we might be able to radically redeploy space. As the blurb in the book says, the program says, I'm an economic geographer interested in the constitution of markets with a big M, understood both as economic abstractions, the market and the economy, but also the practices that we undertake to reproduce the market and the economy as particular things and people and crucially ideas and imaginations come together in places that we call the marketplace. The main thrust of my research is to examine how such marketplaces are assembled and reproduced, and subsequently how such places lead to the reproduction of markets and economies. In the broader sense and vice versa, I stress imaginary. When it comes to markets and economies with a big M and a big E, and the places and spaces more generally, engaging with imagination reminds us that most of what we do as humans depends on our capacity to imagine realities that interface with the material demands of being a biological organism. Historian Yuval Noah Harari, in his 2011 book *Sapiens*, suggests that a defining feature of Homo sapiens at writ is our capacity to conflict subjective reality, a reality that we as individuals and as collectives of individuals, i.e. societies, produce through social imagination, with objective reality, the reality that exists outside of ourselves. We can call this nature, if we like, deploying such imaginations for the purposes of social organization. This posits subjective reality as a response to objective reality. We can change what we do and how we go about it, engaging with objective reality in the ways that we think best suit our purposes and interests. But we always have to engage with reality. For geographers, this means that we make places to confront reality. Geographer Bob Sack articulates this very nicely in the way that he describes place and placemaking. For instance, we make marketplaces and practice markets to facilitate the gathering and distribution of resources, namely food, water, and energy, to reproduce our bodies and our societies. Economy itself, of course, just means just this: the ways in which social organizations distribute resources. Collectively, we've decided that the market is the most efficient way to distribute these resources, and we have developed the conventions of the marketplace as a way to facilitate the negotiations and exchanges that characterize and ultimately reproduce the market economy. Marketplace effectively mediates between the subjective abstractions of the market and the materiality of the objective world. The trick is to remember that the subjective reality, that of markets along with its institutions and its organizations that comprise the marketplace, do not equate to objective reality, the need to manage and distribute resources. Or to paraphrase anthropologist David Graeber, if we want to stop doing market economies tomorrow, then we could. However, we still have to find a way to manage and distribute resources, or in slightly shorter words, feed and clothe ourselves. Geographers Kathy Gibson and Julie Graham challenges the whole idea of the market economy as defined by capitalism, suggesting that capitalism is not the dominant form of economic organization at all. They instead argue that multiple and diverse economies operate alongside, underneath, and in support of market capitalism, and always have done so. Regardless, however, of capitalism's scope and scale to transform the world and to make an indelible impression on the planetary system is unrivaled. Thus, we need to reconsider the transformative capacity of subjective reality, the ways it remakes the objective world, and more importantly, our ability to recognize that world as it emerges. Even though it is of our own devising, the Anthropocene presents one such emergent objective reality, characterized by a complex interconnection of vital resources and by the profoundly far-reaching effects effects that interfering in them can have. The Anthropocene, or to adopt Jason Moore's terminology, capitalocene, has fundamentally altered our potential to mobilize space. And at the same time, it is the product of us manipulating it. For example, contemporary food provision rendered by agrocapitalism has largely erased seasonality for those of us who can afford it, and the precariousness that the seasonality of food brings. It is often argued that with a more equitable distribution system, food scarcity under this new regime could well be a thing in the past. Yet this has come at an extreme cost: the massive dependence on fossil fuels at nearly all stages of production, and consequently the superheating of the atmosphere, which, if continues, will lead to untold ramifications for us all, starting with the world's poor first. This reality thus presents us with a trap. We cannot possibly continue to utilize the resources, namely fossil fuels, upon which we depend to reproduce ourselves, yet at the same time we seemingly must. Perhaps more profoundly, it is because we evolved through the Pleistocene, a different geological epoch, characterized by us reaching the top of the food chain but being largely subjected to the natural world, that we are ill-equipped, evolutionarily speaking, and probably socially speaking as well, to even gauge the kind of experiences that we will need for, let alone develop the institutions in order to adapt to, the new reality that the Anthropocene presents us with, and then hopefully see it through. My point in delving into this rather turgid theoretical position is to remind us that our capacity to change what we do is tied to our capacity to imagine that change. However, by its very nature, the Anthropocene will force us to imagine changes that we might not be able to imagine. So, back to chickens. Chickens emerged as a domestic food source in Southeast Asia during the time of the agricultural revolution, roughly 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BCE. The date and location is still subject to some debate amongst archaeologists, I need to point out. Some place it as far back as 10,000 BCE, others say closer to 8 or 6. It doesn't matter for today, at least. Evidence suggests that they have moved to Western Europe by about 2,000 years ago, where they were eventually imported into the Americas with successive waves of European colonization. Although breeding for particular characteristics has long been part of animal husbandry, during this time period there is considerable variation in domestic chickens, with formal breeds not coalescing until the 18th and 19th century, usually at the hands of hobbyist gentlemen, in quotation marks, naturalists, who were interested in farming as a leisure pursuit. During this time, however, food becomes a component of international political economy and enters into market relations. Owing to its particular material characteristics, namely the relatively short shelf life without refrigeration, chicken production and its commercialization remains largely localized, restricted to nearby and often live trade, something that one can still see in many marketplaces in big cities. Chickens are the quintessential, rather they were the quintessential farmyard animal, and attempts at scaling up production were generally met with failure because of disease and predation. Simply, chickens could not be successfully grown indoors. In the 1930s and 40s, however, a blend of state-sponsored agricultural science and other technological improvements surrounding the Great Depression and New Deal agricultural policies, particularly the development of vitamin and later antibiotic-supplemented feed, allows chickens to be raised indoors. Alongside that, refrigeration allows their carcasses to be transported and retailed in more distant markets. This heralds an entirely new era for chickens. They could now be raised commercially indoors, shipped long distances. Soon thereafter, technoscience became focused on growing bigger broiler chickens more quickly and on business technology for the managing and optimizing of the increasingly complex logistics of big agribusiness. I've made a schematic that kind of shows the multiple entangled bits of chicken here. With a feed conversion ratio of roughly 1.5 to 1, the state of play today is that a commercial broiler of about 2 kilos can be grown out in about 40 days. And that nearly all of these share the same genotype, as I said earlier, which was established in the 1960s, meaning that they are virtually identical and an entirely different animal than that which would have inhabited farmyards less than a century ago. This 40-day grow-out period, I point out, is brushing up against biological hard limits, or so I'm told. There's a 28-day chicken, and researchers think that they can lower that to 20 days, but it won't be commercially viable. I'll take this on in a little bit. To iterate my point, however, the chickens we eat today are entirely the product of a marriage between agriculture and biotechnological research, as well as an extremely sophisticated business practices that include vertical and horizontal integration of the whole production chain, grain milling, eggs, hatching, slaughter, processing, packaging, though the actual farming is typically outsourced or farmed out to farms as a way of displacing production risk. As well as a system of international trade governance that allows for the easiest possible movement of products from one place to another. Here is an image of a supply chain, or at least one version of a broiler chicken supply chain. For ecologists in the room, you might want to view this as a flow of energies from one place to another. But it highlights how complex a modern chicken has become. This image shows us something different. If we track along the bottom, we can see the number of broiler chickens has gone up steadily since the 1930s, particularly since about 1950. If we look at the top number, though, we can see that the weight of chickens has gone up by roughly threefold. There's a scaling issue with my plot there. But the point is, as we have been growing more and more chickens, their biomass has gone like that. They've got bigger, as well as more of them. And those with very, very keen eyes, the reason I've scaled the graph like this, can see that in roughly 1973-74, there's a slight dip that we can attribute to the oil embargo and OPEC, showing how precisely industrial agriculture, like chickens, is tied to the input of fossil fuels at all stages of the production process. We can also see the financial crisis of 2008. One of the things about chickens is they have to eat stuff. This is an experimental diet. Finding data on ubiquitous chicken food is very hard because these are all proprietary things. This came from a paper by a collection of Brazilian researchers who were testing the efficacy of antibiotic additions to feed to make them grow faster, bigger, stronger, and more easily. So if you look at the top, the main ingredients of most commercially available chicken feeds remains maize or corn, soybeans and another soy product, and the antibiotic below. The geography of all this is actually quite fascinating. I've showed this picture before. I haven't done this here, but through some simple geographical data analysis and visualization, we can see the movement of industrial broiler production move around the world, starting in the US Northeast, moving to the South, US South that is, and the production model I just described is now colloquially known as a Southern model. This model has been exported around the world and is the dominant form of chicken production today. The rapid increase of industrial broiler chicken production corresponds to other similar growth curves associated with the Great Acceleration, the Anthropocene and/or Capitalism. And this shows nicely the relationship between chickens and other aspects of energy input and output. So you can see the growth of fertilizer consumption, not exclusively to chickens, but that's overall production, or rather consumption. There's the oil crisis. We can see tropical forest loss. There is a caveat to that, which is the amount of forest loss below 1700-ish is calculated on some modeling, but it shows how much primary forest we have given over to agriculture. And we can also see primary energy use. This isn't restricted just to agriculture, but agriculture makes up most of it. And there's the oil crisis again. And as you can imagine, I'm driving towards this. We have population growth. I noted that, I can't remember his name now, population bomb guy, Robert Ehrlich was here last year. Paul Ehrlich, sorry. Sorry? Paul Ehrlich, thank you. I read the book years ago. There are some similar arguments that could be made about that. I don't want to go into those. But one of the driving things for this kind of production is this, which is the WHO UN food security mandates. A fun exercise is to look at the way in which the text has changed over the years. Availability at all times of adequate world food supplies, to ensure that, or moving towards ensuring that all people at all times have both physical and economic access to basic food, access of all people at all times to enough food, to finally where we are today, nutritious food that meets the dietary needs and food preferences of an active, healthy lifestyle. And to this I turn to a research question that informed the early part of this research, and it kind of gets to the story of how I got into Brazilian chickens in the first place. In an era of unprecedented food access, security, availability, safety, in the global north and west at least, why are we so worried about our food? I probably have already made a pretty good case about why we should be worried about our food, but if we look at media, if we look at any number of other sources, there's a sense of anxiety about food. It's the story of how we got to this place in Mato Grosso, this big chicken production factory, begins in Thailand, of all places, in 2004 and 5. For me, it begins in 2009 when I was a postdoc at the University of Sheffield. I was part of an ERC, European Research Council funded project called CONEX, Consumer Culture in an Age of Anxiety. For those of you who have ever done anything with the ERC, you know how much the European Commission likes acronyms. And this was directed by an amazing geographer and scholar called Peter Jackson. My task was to map the political economy of food, basically. It was a bit more focused than that. And I was looking more closely at Thailand and aquaculture, a far cry from Brazil and the chickens that I'm ultimately talking about. Because of a rather uncomfortable political climate in 2010, I wasn't able to complete the research, so I had to come up with a reason for why chickens were a thing to look at and why I could do it in Brazil, where I've done a lot of research in the past. And there's a connection here. In most respects, CONEX was not a successful project. We never really were able to conceptualize social anxiety like we told the EC we would. And all my work pointed to the ways in which social anxiety is ambiguously located within the space of agri-capitalism. It doesn't take millions of euros to reach this conclusion. The empirical detail behind this conclusion, however, reiterates primary lessons about global political economy, particularly the ways in which economic production, primary economic production, that is the bedrock of many export-led low to middle-income countries and rising powers, is subject to the political, economic, and policy whims of more powerful global geopolitical elites, in this case, the EU. In 2005, a leak in institutional biosecurity led to the infection. Cool. Do I skip that? I'll let you sort that out. Shit. So, what this meant was that Thailand was essentially cut out of world trade for chickens because of the risk that they might pose to worldwide flocks. Let's be clear. Avian influenza, this was H5N1, poses almost no threat to human health, as far as I understand it. Do correct me if I'm wrong on that. It is a serious threat to birds, particularly poultry confined in tight places. This ban, at least according to the evidence from the UK Department for Environment and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, and other similar agents, goes as far as saying this. There's a risk that H5N1 can cross over and become virulent to humans, but it remains primarily an animal disease, but one that can devastate a flock very quickly. This makes it, H5N1, an economic problem rather than a health problem for humans. Commentators, however, have suggested that the public media hysteria over H5N1 is more broadly collected to racism and salient fears of SARS outbreaks that happened a few years earlier, and the well-documented devastation of agriculture that foot and mouth disease and CJD inflicted on the UK. So this ban is motivated by economy and functions to quarantine, and functions as a quarantine, rather, to mitigate against the potential for contamination across political and economic boundaries. However, Thailand's loss was Brazil's gain, and within a few months, and this is also visible within the data, I couldn't find the graph to present, Brazil was able to use its surplus agricultural capacity, a capacity in meat processing, which is available because Brazil's own inabilities to trade with North America because of endemic bovine encephalitis. But it allowed Brazil to corner the market for chicken production and become the second largest producer and the largest exporter in the world. A few twists and turns aside, I had a research visa and a plane ticket and found myself in an office tower in Sao Paulo overlooking the concrete jungle. Doing agricultural research in Brazil is quite fascinating because although one does get to go to farms eventually, you spend most of your time in corporate boardrooms in places like Sao Paulo because it is very, very big business with deeply entrenched political and economic connections. In fact, I had to spend a lot of time in these boardrooms being told about the Brazilian agricultural miracle, its importance in driving the Brazilian economy, and subsequently its responsibility in bringing millions of people out of poverty and into the rising middle class. I should put that in quotation marks, because it turns out the middle class in Brazil is partly a statistical artifact. And according to one research participant, suggests that middle class in this context means having toothbrushes and televisions. In these corporate meetings, I was told not to bother myself with what was the apparent elephant in the room, which is that much of the engine for Brazil's economic growth lies in its massive and hitherto slack agricultural capacity. This capacity is bound up in the irrevocable wholesale clearance of primary tropical forest, dating from early colonial times to roughly the present day, the odd moratoria against it notwithstanding. And from here, the story turns north and west to the southern Amazon. It's the states of Rondônia and Mato Grosso, which are key sites of agricultural transition, a euphemism for primary tropical forest conversion, first to cattle ranching, and then it's a transition to extremely large-scale mechanized agriculture in the form of soya. Ah, cool. Back. So, let's have a look at these numbers again. 500,000 chickens a day is roughly 182,000 and a half chickens a year, 6 chickens a second. It takes 5 kilos of feed to feed 1 chicken to commercial rate, and it takes roughly 1 hectare of land to make 300 kilos of feed. These are, once again, bar napkin calculations. But that equals 3,000 kilograms to 1 hectare, and at 1 chicken per 5 kilograms, 600 chickens a hectare. 833 chickens, for 833 hectares, rather, for 1 day of chickens at 500,000. Boulder is 66.5 square kilometers, according to Google, so there's 8 days of chicken. Where to go? I had a really good map for this. I can't. Is it up? Oh, okay. Back one more. What's on there does not map what's on there. So, there's Boulder. So, we have to remember, though, in this calculus, that 500,000 chickens is just 1 day of chickens. In order to have a production system, we need to have 40 days worth of chicken on deck. So there's my equation for that. So we don't need to just have 40 days worth of chickens on deck, assuming 40-day grow out. We need to have all the food for those chickens ready. Being the geographer that I am, being interested in the spaces of agriculture that I am, we get something like that. That's a field in Mato Grosso owned by the Imagi Corporation, taken from their website in 2014. It's a soybean field that goes on for a rather long time. If we zoom out to a 2-kilometer scale, I took these from my office a couple weeks ago, we have Rondônia, Brazil, where I've done some early research on this, and soybean fields there. And by comparison, we have eastern Colorado. That's eastern Colorado, western Kansas and Nebraska. Or if we want to think about it in these terms, we have the entire state of Rondônia has more or less been cleared for soybean production. And you can see it there. Roughly the size of the United Kingdom fits in the cleared bit. The bit to the south is a slightly different story. This becomes a political and economic story. It's worth pointing out that the reason why this factory, which happens to be owned by JBS Foods, is located in Mato Grosso, makes perfect economic sense. You put your chicken factory next to where there's the soybeans to make the chicken feed. If anyone follows the Brazilian press and is familiar with something called the carne fraca scandal, the weak meat scandal, the owners of JBS are implicated in some dodgy dealings. More recently, Michel Temer, the new president of Brazil, is also implicated in those dealings. This is where I will stop with the politics. I'm not saying anything untoward is happening between the Imaggi family, who the governor of Monte Grosso is one of them, and JBS Foods. I'm not suggesting that, but I don't think that is too far to imagine if we had to. So, I've outlined the spaces of chicken as a production site. And we were thinking about the ways in which looking at chickens in this way extends space, compresses time. I'm going to turn now to the other side of chickens, which is what this picture shows there, and I'll talk about that in a minute, which is the compression of space and ultimately the extension of time. So, borrowing from a colleague, Julie Guthman, who's also at the UC Santa Cruz, who's borrowing from Stephen Colbert. Is that a parasite of a parasite? I don't know what that is. Colbert suggests that the last growth industry in America is our own bodies, maize syrup. And if you remember, corn is the top ingredient of most commercially available food, or commercially available chicken. And this just charts the rapid growth in chicken bones and gets us to this schematic, which shows us the ways and the osteo problems that a chicken has under this regime of being grown very quickly through the help of soya and through maize and through antibiotics. And if we look at these skeletons more closely, the one on the right is a wild jungle fowl, over 365 days old. The one on the left is a broiler chicken that we got from Tesco, boiled up and stuck together into that skeleton. And you could see the differences in these skeletons. Cool, thank you. For those of you who are interested in bones, the ones on the left are extraordinarily soft. They almost boil away when you boil them. They haven't calcified. They haven't had time to calcify, why the biological hard limit is roughly 20 days. I can't help but think of the relationship between corn feeding, or corn feeding of chickens, and the corn feeding of children. That's a bit borrowed from another colleague of mine called Naomi Sykes, who helped me put together the chicken skeletons, an archaeologist at Nottingham. What I want to think about, though, is the spatial logic of capitalism in this case. The ways it optimizes efficiency, it compresses time or extends time, depending on how we look at it, and it reduces animals to productive units. Something very nicely articulated by designer Andre Ford in his model of the future chicken. So I have just given us a very, very bleak outlook for chickens, for agriculture. So most of us in the room, we're fairly wealthy, we are highly intelligent, we are good consumers. And if we eat chicken, we might buy chickens that look something like this. Those are corn-fed, by the way, you can tell by the color. A combination of the best of the old and new, the breed is developed to carry more breast meat and is of a paler color, not that pale really, raised in a high welfare environment. They are fully free range, fed on a natural diet, and grown slowly to full maturity, up to 75 days. Keeping in mind that a red jungle fowl reaches maturity after a year, the natural chicken if you like. What this does for good food consumers is it seeks to reclaim space and time from agriculture, from industrial agriculture. It does so discursively, and these chickens are available in places that look like this. That happens to be London's Borough Market, where I've done more research than I really care to think about. But as you can see, it looks very similar to any number of other good, fine food market, where such narratives are continuously reproduced. So we have this modern, what do I call it here? The alternative chicken. Invented in the 90s as a reaction to modern techno-science, broiler chickens. It has the same sort of stuff going on with it because it's basically the same chicken, only slightly branded differently. It has a bunch of different discourses attached to it. Agriculture bad, free range, farmers, traceable, know your farmer, slow food. Or we can just do that with it. It's happy, we're happy, let's go on, we're fine. I don't like that result because it still means we're living in the same system of food production, maybe slightly kinder and gentler, but still the same system fundamentally. So I'm now going to draw, again from the Anthropocene's wicked problem, and think about alternative economies. I'm afraid I'm probably up against my own time limit, so I'm going to blast through the theory and talk about what my current project is doing, which evokes something that has been called by the UK ESRC and beyond nexus thinking. It's something that we already do here anyway, but I'll talk about it anyway. Empirically, it wants us to examine the interconnections between vital resources, food, water, and energy. What it really does, though, is encourages us to be interdisciplinary, to erode ontological boundaries. I keep in mind, I'm not the first person to say the word ontology here. That happened yesterday. Thank you for that. You set me up nicely. The point is, we're always connected, but the question becomes how, and how are these, and how do they create possibilities for new spaces? Remind me to copy edit my slides later. So I turn to my current project. This is a map of southern Sao Paulo state, and I'm interested in this area right here. It's the bit between Sao Paulo and Rio. Why this bit rather than other bits? Because it's interesting. It's not Rio, it's not Sao Paulo where most research happens, or most research is focused. It's not the agricultural lands up here or Mato Grosso, which is somewhere on the next floor. And what we're interested in doing is thinking about the interconnections between food, water, and energy. What kind of new spaces can we create, or what have already been created, that can enable us to possibly learn lessons about the future that we know we must face? Here's a picture of it from space. There's some farming. It's rather diverse. There's quite a lot of, what did I do? There we go. There's quite a lot of light industry, logistics. As the previous slide said, nearly all of Sao Paulo's state's economy happens in this region, and it makes up a significant part of Brazil's economy as a whole. And here's what it looks like on the ground. And this field is really telling. That's a monoculture of sugarcane. The farm has water problems. It has poor growth rates of crops. The animals don't do particularly well. That is a diverse culture. There's trees, there's a bit of sugarcane, there's some other kinds of plants, there's some fallow fields, healthy water supply. They operate on a surplus, in fact. Healthy animals, higher production of milk, and so forth. So the lesson from here to think about is maybe doing things in such a big way isn't so good. I want to close on thinking about this space, though. These pictures are taken in a place in Nottingham, in Nottingham, UK. For those who don't know Nottingham, in 2011, Nottingham had, according to the BBC at least, a per capita income of around £11,000. That's what I said. Whoa. I make significantly more than that. I just had kids, so my wife wasn't working. I was a single income family for a while, and I was kind of feeling, some pressures, like, well, I'm going to have to drink blended scotch now, or something to that effect. And I asked my anthropology colleagues, people who know more about urban systems, et cetera, how do I explain this? How do you survive on £11,000 a year in the UK? In Nottingham, which isn't that cheap, really. And the immediate response was, oh yeah, informal economy, which means drug dealing. I can't say that publicly. So I went to Nottingham. I put my boots on, and I wandered around. So I was looking for survival at this point, and I found this. This is a community garden located in a place called the Meadows. The Meadows is one of the rougher neighborhoods of Nottingham. It's not St. Anne's, if you know Nottingham, but it's close. And what this community garden was derelict wasteland, in the words of my informants. It was a dead space in terms of cities. People dump trash there, people walk their dogs there. If you have very good eyes, you can see that there's a primary school right there, so the kids in the neighborhood would have to walk through this litter-strewn, dog waste-infested area. And one of the people who lived right next door happened to be from the Caribbean. And if you know Caribbean people, particularly in the UK, they do like to garden. I'm generalizing, but my colleagues who are Caribbean confirmed this for me. They said, we like to garden, we like to dig things up in the ground. We have to grow stuff. So this man cleared this field, and he set up a garden. I'm not going to suggest that we can feed the world on community gardens. This garden produces maybe enough food for the community at large for like a day, if we were to amass it all up over the course of the year. But what it has done is it's raised awareness about healthy food, truly healthy food. It's raised the idea that we can come together as communities, make new spaces, and become healthier. And we can kind of track, and I haven't quite done this in a careful empirical way, we can kind of track better community health outcomes out of this, better social outcomes. The community was scheduled for demolition because this happens to be very close to Nottingham City Centre, prime development land, and they managed to avoid this. Now, I'm going to stop there, except to maybe think that, get you all to think about the ways we can creatively remake and reuse space. Some references, as many as I could fit on a slide at least. I've got to thank and acknowledge my colleagues with this, particularly Carrie Bennett and Catherine Walker, who are the postdocs on these respective projects. The others are equally valuable in all this, but I have got the greatest postdocs on Earth. From what I've seen yesterday and this morning, this is probably a title that we could come together and fight over, but they are really great and they need to be acknowledged in this. And you can see the various people who either employ me or underwrite my work. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions if there's time.
Thank you very much. And the recurring image for me for this symposium is going to be two chicken skeletons next to each other. I think we've got time for, let's say, one succinct question and one succinct answer. And I know I've been favoring the front, so I'm going to look to the back to see if I can see any hands there. Okay, up in the middle, caught my eye with determined waving.
Out of all your slides there, I'm going to point out what I think is ultimately the hole in the ship on the Titanic. On the slide that you showed, the feed that was going into the chickens in the very bottom, the antibiotic growth promoter, colistin was the growth promoter, and if you're familiar with the problem with antibiotic resistance, that's the antibiotic of last resort. So if that's going into our food supply on a regular basis, which it may be not colistin, but there are many, many antibiotic growth promoters, and that's what we need to be talking about, and we need to be talking about our universities that buy this food from the industrial food supply and feed it to our students, our children. I'll get off my soapbox.
Yes, that's my response. There is a lot in this that I think you all can unpack very nicely, far better than I can. I don't know my antibiotics from my other antibiotics and various things like that, but thank you for pointing that out. Feeding our kids, and university students are increasingly kids, is important. Getting them to think about some of these issues and changing their practices is what we need to encourage. Thank you, everyone.